In this module, we will further explore the concept of call access control, which can be achieved by using context and includes in the asterisk dial plan. By the end of the module, you should understand how to configure the dial plan to easily and effectively control which extensions are available to which callers, without having to add redundant extensions. The primary benefit of this is to logically separate groups of extensions. For example, you can make sure that inbound calls never have access to dial back out of the system using expensive trunks, and you can limit which internal users can have access to certain routes or call features. In our last module, we looked at include statements and how they can be used to affect dial plan logic and permit users to reach extensions contained in contexts besides the one in which the call begins. Before that, we introduced the concept of pattern matching. We'll now combine these ideas to configure a dial plan with several different classes of access. In this example, there's only one class of access. We've assumed that all outbound calls use the same external trunk, and we've used a variable to refer to it. The outbound context is included in the internal user's context, thereby allowing every user the same level of service. Instead, to create different classes of access, we will configure more granular service levels based on what types of calls are permitted at each level. We'll have different service levels for local calling, long-distance calling, and international calling. To begin, we'll add a layer of abstraction from our users by changing the context configured in sip.conf for each one. Remember that the context set in sip.conf determines where asterisk will look for a match when a call is made from that phone, not when someone is trying to call the device. For each of our SIP accounts, we'll assign one of three contexts we created based on that user's class of access. In a few minutes, we'll add extensions to these contexts. The local context will contain extensions for dialing in the local calling area. This might be for phones in a public area or for call center representatives who never need to transfer calls long distance. The long distance context will contain extensions for dialing long distance. This context will be configured for phones or users who are significantly less restricted but who still don't have completely open access. Finally, the international context will contain extensions for making international calls. This context is for phones or users with the broadest access. This will include executives or sales associates who need to call people in other countries. In extensions.conf, we'll now add some basic outbound extensions appropriate for each context. In configuring our pattern matches, we'll assume that the office using this dial plan is at Digium's headquarters in Huntsville, Alabama, in the United States. The local context can dial 7-digit numbers starting with any digit but a 0 or 1, as well as 11-digit numbers starting with 1, 2, 5, 6. This is because 256 is the area code in the North American numbering plan for Huntsville, and calls dialed in the local area code are not treated as long-distance calls for toll purposes. The long-distance context will include a single pattern match extension to dial 1 plus any 10-digit number in the North American numbering plan. This means that there's a 3-digit area code followed by a 7-digit local number. Neither the area code nor the local number can begin with a 0 or a 1. The international context will have a different pattern that allows a dial to any number beginning with 011 that has at least one additional digit. This pattern is used because different countries use different numbers of digits in their numbering plans, so there's no easy way to know just how many digits will need to be dialed for an international number. Please note that this dial plan is only an example, and that it's not appropriate for use in a production environment. A real-world dial plan would likely have several patterns that would hang up instead of dial to prevent calls to premium rate numbers, 900 numbers, and certain area codes used by scammers. There might also be extensions in the local context that permit calls to toll-free numbers outside the local calling area because they don't incur any charges. Aside from the extensions to make outbound calls, we'll also include internal_users into each of these contexts. This way, any user assigned to any of these contexts can still dial other internal users. At this point, you may have realized that this example isn't quite complete or accurate. The dial plan in its current state would restrict our most privileged users in a way we don't want. Our international context can dial internationally and internal numbers, but it cannot dial local or long-distance numbers. Similarly, the long-distance context can't dial local 7-digit numbers even though it should have that access. It's more natural that we would want more privileged users to have at least as much access as less privileged users. To implement this, just add the local context to long distance and the local and long distance context to international. Now each class of access can dial all the types of numbers they should be able to. We can now simplify the Dialplan further because includes are transitive in nature. Explicitly listing each context a given access level includes is redundant because it transitively includes them already. The current configuration is not recommended because it will cause multiple copies of the same extension to appear in each context. Instead, we can configure each context to include only the context for the access class immediately below it. This lets us remove several unnecessary includes without changing the behavior of the Dialplan at all. This means that we have a shorter and simpler Dialplan. A good rule of thumb is to keep your Dialplan as simple and short as possible so that it is as easy to maintain as possible. Of course, this only works when there's a direct mapping of privilege levels. If the long-distance context included any extensions that international users should not have access to, you wouldn't want to include the long-distance context in the international context. When cascading includes across multiple contexts like this, it's easiest to understand and follow along if the contexts are listed in order in extensions.conf. Asterisk doesn't care what order the contexts are listed, but a human reader can more easily interpret context when they're listed in a sensible order. Some Asterisk administrators map out their Dialplans using block diagrams or other tools commonly used to model network resources. We highly recommend this practice. The preceding examples demonstrate how to define and use classes of access in the Dialplan via contexts, pattern matching, and include statements, as well as configuring sip.conf. You should now be familiar with the mechanics of inheriting other classes of access via transitive includes and the potential pitfalls in configuring this incorrectly. In the next module, we'll take a step away from the Dialplan and learn about call features configurable in features.conf.